The pry bar caught on rusted metal, and Marlowe Hale's knuckles split open before the hinge ever gave. She didn't stop. 22 years old, hair stuck to her forehead with sweat, despite the cold coming off the stone floor. She braced her boot against the base of the cabinet and pulled again. Somewhere above her, wind found a gap in the church's broken steeple and made a sound like a held breath finally let out. Dust sifted down through a shaft of grey light, and for a second, the whole sanctuary seemed to be watching her. She had exactly $4 and change to her name when this cabinet was still just a rumor. But 3 weeks before this moment, before the crowbar, before the blood on her hand, before she understood what Bethel Creek Chapel had been hiding behind its bricked-up vestry wall for the better part of 60 years, Marlowe had been standing on a curb in the rain, with 2 garbage bags of everything she owned, waiting for a bus she wasn't sure she could afford to ride to the end of the line. The landlord hadn't even given her the courtesy of a real conversation, just a taped notice, then a lock she couldn't open. $5. That's what she'd counted, twice, sitting on the curb with her knees pulled to her chest, the bills soft and worn, like they'd been folded and unfolded by someone else's hard year before they ever reached hers. She'd grown up moving between her aunt's place and 2 different foster placements after her mother died, and if there was one thing that childhood had taught her, it was how to disappear quietly and start over somewhere new without asking anyone for help. So she didn't cry on that curb. She just started walking, because walking was free. And somewhere in that walking she passed the county courthouse and saw a taped-up notice in the window that would change everything. A small legal listing, easy to miss, for a property no one had claimed in decades. 112 years old, sitting on 4 acres at the edge of town, delinquent on its taxes for so long that the county just wanted it gone. Opening bid, $340. She didn't have $340. She had 5. But she had something else, too. A name in an old shoebox of her mother's papers that she'd never let herself think too hard about. A small check that had shown up once a year from a great-uncle nobody talked about, folded into an envelope with no return address. She'd never touched that money before. That week, for the first time, she did. Can you imagine standing in front of a courthouse counter with your entire life folded into an envelope, watching a stranger stamp a piece of paper that hands you a crumbling church nobody wanted? That's where Marlowe found herself, and it's where we're picking up her story today. So if you're the kind of person who believes an ending like hers is worth sitting with all the way through, go ahead and hit subscribe, because there's a lot more waiting behind that vestry wall than either of us expected. The building itself looked like it had given up, paint peeling in long grey curls off the clapboard siding, one stained glass window boarded over, with plywood gone soft at the edges, the bell tower listing just slightly to the east, like it was tired of standing straight. Inside smelled like wet hymnals and cold ash. Her boots left prints in dust that hadn't been disturbed in what felt like a generation. She almost turned around twice on her first walk through. Almost. But there was nowhere else for her to turn around to. It took her 2.5 weeks of clearing rubble, replacing rotted floorboards, and sleeping in a repaired back office with a space heater and a sleeping bag, before she found the loose brick behind the old choir loft, the one that didn't match the mortar line around it, the one that sounded hollow when she knocked her knuckle against it, out of nothing more than idle curiosity. Behind it, a narrow cavity, and inside that cavity, a cabinet bolted into the church's original stone foundation. Its door, sealed with a rusted padlock, no key in town would fit. That's the cabinet she was standing in front of now, crowbar in her bleeding hand, dust falling like slow snow around her shoulders. Whatever was locked inside Bethel Creek Chapel, somebody had wanted it to stay hidden for a very long time, and the hinge had just started to give. The bus hadn't taken her all the way to Bethel Creek. The driver said the last stretch of road wasn't worth the detour for one passenger, So she walked the final 2 miles with both garbage bags cutting red lines into her palms, past a gas station with a hand-painted sign, and a diner that looked like it had been serving the same regulars since 1974. She smelled the church before she saw it. Wet wood and cold stone, carried on air that still had winter in it, even though the calendar said April. When Bethel Creek Chapel finally came into view, at the end of a gravel turnoff, half swallowed by overgrown junipers, Marlowe stood very still for a long moment. The plywood over the west window had gone soft and grey, like it might crumble if she touched it. One corner of the roof sagged just enough to worry her. A rusted historical marker leaned sideways in the weeds, its lettering worn down to almost nothing. She thought, briefly, about turning around. There was nowhere to turn around to, so she walked up the front steps instead, feeling them give slightly under her weight, and let herself in with a key that had been mailed to her in a manila envelope with no note, no explanation, nothing but her name typed on a shipping label like she was a package instead of a person. Inside, the air was colder than outside, which didn't seem possible until she understood why. Stone floors, no insulation, 60 years of neglect settled into every corner like dust that had learned to stay. Pews lined either side of the center aisle, half of them collapsed or missing entirely, and up front, behind where an altar must have once stood, a wall of stained glass had been boarded over so completely that only thin blades of colored light slipped through the gaps, laying stripes of red and gold and blue across the floor, like something spilled and forgotten. She sat down in the third pew from the back, the only one that looked sturdy enough to trust, and let herself cry for exactly 4 minutes. Then she stood up, found the driest corner of what used to be a small office behind the choir loft, and started making a list of what needed doing first. By the time the sun came up the next morning, she had swept 1 full room clean enough to sleep in. She didn't expect visitors, but word travels fast in a town with 1 gas station, and by her 3rd day, a truck rattled up the gravel drive and idled there long enough that she came outside to see who it was. The man behind the wheel didn't get out right away. When he finally did, he was maybe 60, built like someone who'd worked with his hands his whole life, wearing a canvas coat with a hardware store logo stitched crooked over the pocket. He introduced himself as Roy Tanner, said he ran the feed and hardware store in town, and asked, without much warmth in it, whether she knew what she'd bought. "I bought a church," she said. "You bought 4 acres the county's been trying to unload for 11 years, Roy said. "There was talk a few years back of a processing plant going in on this land. Would have brought 40 jobs to this town. Instead, you got yourself a roof that's going to cave in by August." He looked past her at the building like it had personally wronged him. "Just so you know what you're standing on." She didn't have an answer for that. He drove off without offering to help, which told her something about him even if she couldn't have said exactly what. It was different 2 days later, when an old blue pickup pulled in slow and quiet, no rattle to it, and a man got out who moved like his knees had opinions about the weather. He introduced himself simply as Hollis. Didn't offer a last name at first. He'd brought a box of roofing nails and a tarp, unprompted, and set them on the church steps like he'd been planning to all along. "Wasn't gonna let the first hard rain finish what time started," he said, by way of explanation. And that was the whole conversation for a while. Hollis Pratt turned out to be a retired carpenter who'd lived alone at the edge of town since his wife passed 6 winters back, and though he didn't say much, what he did say tended to matter. He showed her how to test a floor joist for rot by pressing her thumb into it. He taught her which nails to save and which to toss. He never asked why she was doing this, and she never explained, and somehow that made it easier to keep going. It was Hollis who mentioned, almost offhand, while they were clearing debris from the choir loft on her 2nd week, that the church used to have a caretaker, a quiet man, older, who kept to himself and used to be heard playing the organ some evenings, even after service had ended for good. "Cyrus, I believe his name was," Hollis said, wiping dust from his hands. "Showed up one October, gone the next. Nobody ever asked where. Folks didn't do that as much back then." She filed the name away without knowing why it mattered yet. Roy came back twice more that first month, each time with a fresh reason she should quit. A structural concern, a rumor about the county revoking her deed on some technicality, a comment about how some things are better left buried. He said that last part almost to himself, standing at the top of the cellar stairs one afternoon, and when she asked what he meant, he just shook his head and changed the subject. The town, for the most part, watched her the way you'd watch weather you weren't sure about, waiting to see which way it would break. A few people waved. Most didn't. The woman at the gas station started setting aside day-old bread for her without being asked, which felt like its own kind of welcome. By the end of that first month, the roof was patched enough to survive a storm, the office was livable, and she had cleared 2 full rows of pews down to bare, oiled wood. She'd also started noticing things she couldn't explain: a brick behind the choir loft that sounded hollow under her knuckles, a floorboard near the old baptismal font that had been replaced more recently than the ones around it, and a second-story window, visible only from outside, that didn't seem to correspond to any room she'd found on the inside. She didn't have time to chase any of it yet. There was too much else falling apart. But she started keeping a second list, separate from the repairs, a list of things about Bethel Creek Chapel that didn't add up, and some nights, before sleep took her, she'd take it out and read it over by flashlight, wondering which question she'd end up answering first. The second list grew faster than the first. By the start of her second month at Bethel Creek Chapel, Marlowe had scraped, sanded, and oiled her way through most of the sanctuary floor, and in doing so, she'd started to understand the building the way you understand a person you've lived with a while. Its habits, its sore spots, the places where something didn't quite sit right. The hollow brick behind the choir loft was one of those places. She'd knocked on it a dozen times since Hollis first pointed it out, always meaning to dig further, always getting pulled away by something more urgent: a leak, a warped door, a hinge that needed replacing before the weather turned. It was Hollis who finally forced the question, in his quiet way, on a grey Tuesday morning while they were reinforcing a support beam under the choir loft floor. "You ever wonder why a church this size only ever had the one caretaker?" he asked, not looking up from his work. "Most places like this, you'd have a rotation. Deacons, groundskeepers. This place had Cyrus, and near as anybody remembers, just Cyrus, for going on 30 years. Maybe he didn't want help," Marlowe said. "Maybe," Hollis agreed. "Or maybe there wasn't anything here worth 2 sets of eyes on." He didn't explain what he meant by that, and when she pushed, he just shrugged and said some things weren't his to tell. It was the second time in 2 weeks someone in this town had said something like that to her, and both times they'd stopped just short of telling her anything useful. She brought it up with Ruth Ann Simmons the following afternoon, the woman who ran the gas station and had taken to setting aside day-old bread for her every few days, along with the occasional jar of preserves that showed up without explanation on the church steps. Ruth Ann was somewhere in her 70s, sharp-eyed, with a laugh that came easy, and a memory that seemed to hold the whole town's history in careful order. "Cyrus Whitfield," Ruth Ann said, when Marlowe finally worked up the nerve to ask. "Now there's a name I haven't said out loud in years." She wiped down the counter slowly, like she was deciding how much of the story was hers to give away. Kept to himself. Played that organ some evenings long after the congregation stopped coming. And it did stop, sometime in the 60s. Church emptied out slow, like water going down a drain, until it was just him rattling around in there alone. What happened to him? Left? One October, like Hollis probably told you. Didn't say goodbye to anybody I know of. Some folks said he'd finally had enough of being lonely out here. Others said. She stopped herself, shook her head. Doesn't matter what others said. Wasn't never proven. Any of it. Marlowe wanted to press further, but something in Ruth Ann's face told her this wasn't a door that was going to open today. She thanked her for the bread and walked the 2 miles back to the church, turning the name over in her head. Cyrus Whitfield, a man who'd played an organ to an empty room for years, and then vanished without a word. The rebuilding, in the meantime, refused to slow down for her curiosity. She was averaging 12-hour days now, scraping decades of soot off the sanctuary walls, replacing rot in the sills, learning by necessity how to rewire an ancient fuse box after blowing it twice, trying to run a space heater and a hot plate at the same time. Her hands had changed in a month. Calluses where there used to be softness. A permanent half-moon of dirt under her nails, no amount of scrubbing fully lifted. She caught her reflection once in a cracked window pane and almost didn't recognize the person looking back. Not because she looked worse, but because she looked like someone who'd decided to stay. Roy Tanner came around twice more that month, and both times his warnings had sharpened into something closer to pressure. The second visit, he brought papers. A proposal, he said, from a development group out of the county seat, offering to buy the land outright for enough money to start over somewhere warmer, somewhere easier. "It's a fair number," he said, sliding the folder across the tailgate of his truck toward her. "More than fair, considering the state of the place." "Why do you care so much whether I sell?" she asked, and for the first time, something flickered across his face that looked almost like guilt before he covered it. "I don't care," he said too quickly. "I just don't like watching somebody drown." He left without taking the folder back, which meant it sat on her kitchen counter for the rest of the week, an unanswered question in paper form. It was Hollis, again, who gave her the next real piece of the puzzle, though he didn't seem to realize its weight when he said it. They'd been working together to clear out a storage closet behind the old vestry, hauling out decades of moth-eaten hymnals and broken candle stands, when he found, tucked behind a support post, a small brass plate, tarnished nearly black, engraved with a single line, "For Everett, who never stopped believing the roof would hold." Neither of them recognized the name Everett. It didn't match Cyrus, didn't match anyone Hollis could place off the top of his head. He turned it over in his weathered hands for a long moment, before setting it on the windowsill, where it caught the last of the afternoon light. "Somebody loved this place enough to put that up," he said. "That's not nothing." That night, Marlowe added Everett to her second list, right below hollow brick, choir loft, and upstairs window with no matching room. She was starting to suspect the list wasn't really about the building anymore. It was about the people who'd passed through it, and the parts of their story nobody in town seemed willing to finish out loud. She still hadn't opened the wall behind the loft. Some nights she told herself it was because she didn't have the tools. Other nights, lying in the dark with the wind finding its way through the same gap in the steeple it always had, she admitted the truer reason, that whatever was back there had waited this long, and some part of her wasn't ready yet to be the one who disturbed it. But the following morning, clearing frost off the front steps before sunrise, she found something that made waiting a little harder. A single fresh footprint in the mud near the cellar door, too large to be hers, leading up to the building, and then, strangely, leading nowhere back out. The footprint didn't belong to anyone she recognized, and it didn't come back. She stood over it for a long time that morning, coffee going cold in her hand, studying the way the mud had frozen overnight into a hard, perfect impression. A boot, size large, the tread worn smooth in the center like whoever wore it favored one leg. It led up to the cellar door. It did not lead away. She checked twice, walking the perimeter of the building in the thin gray light, boots crunching over frost, and found nothing. No second set of prints, no sign anyone had circled back around. Just one path, ending at a locked door she hadn't yet found the key to. She didn't tell Roy. She told Hollis, 2 days later, half expecting him to laugh it off. He didn't laugh. He walked the same path she had, crouched down at the frozen print with his hands on his knees, and was quiet long enough that she started to worry. "Cellar door's been locked since before you got here," he said finally. "Whoever made that print either had a key or knows this building better than anybody left alive. That's not comforting. Wasn't meant to be." He straightened up slowly, the way he always did, like his body needed a moment to agree with his intentions. "I'll bring a new lock next time I come by, better one, but I wouldn't lose sleep over it. Man wanted to hurt somebody, he wouldn't leave a print behind for you to find. He'd have made sure you never saw him at all. It should have been reassuring. It mostly wasn't." The days that followed folded into a rhythm she'd come to recognize as the shape of real work. Waking before light, coffee on the hot plate, 3 or 4 hours on the roof or the walls, before her hands started shaking from cold and effort. A break for whatever Ruth Ann had left on the steps, then back to it until the light went thin and grey again. She learned to mend a section of collapsed ceiling using lumber salvaged from the fallen pews, learned to patch stained glass with a kit she'd ordered with money she didn't really have, learned that patience was a skill like any other, one she was getting better at daily, whether she meant to or not. It was during one of these long afternoons, sanding down a section of the choir loft railing, that she finally worked up the nerve to return to the hollow brick. She'd passed it 100 times by now, always with some excuse ready. Not enough light, too much else to do, the growing certainty that whatever was behind it deserved more care than she could give it in a rushed hour before dark. But that afternoon, alone in the church with nothing but the wind moving through the gap in the steeple and dust turning gold in the low sun, she set down her sandpaper and pressed her palm flat against the brick. It gave, slightly, under pressure, not mortar set, the way it should have been, but loose, resting in its slot, like it had been placed there, rather than built there. She worked her fingers into the seam, feeling the old mortar crumble to powder, and after several minutes of careful prying, the brick came free in her hand, lighter than it should have been, revealing a narrow cavity behind it, just deep enough to fit an arm. Her heart was doing something complicated in her chest. She reached in anyway. What she found wasn't the treasure she might have imagined, lying awake picturing it some nights. It was a small tin box, rusted at the corners, the kind used decades ago to hold tobacco or small tools. Inside, wrapped in a handkerchief gone brittle and yellow with age, was a single key, old-fashioned, iron, heavier than a key that size had any right to be, and a folded scrap of paper with 3 words written on it in careful, old-fashioned handwriting, "Not yet, Cyrus." She sat with that for a long time. Not yet. As though whoever left it there had known someone would eventually find it, and was speaking directly to the man who might come looking, or speaking to himself, some version of himself not ready for what the key would open. She turned the paper over, looking for more, and found nothing. Just those 3 words, and beneath them, so faint she almost missed it, a small drawing, a rough sketch of what looked like a cabinet, bolted to a wall, its door marked with an X, the cabinet in the vestry, the one behind the choir loft, that she'd found weeks ago and hadn't been able to open. She sat on the floor of the sanctuary until the light went fully out of the room, the iron key resting heavy in her palm, the scrap of paper with its 3 careful words tucked against her knee, and for the first time since she'd arrived at Bethel Creek Chapel, she let herself feel something closer to hope than fear. Not because she understood what waited behind that vestry wall, but because someone, a long time ago, had gone to the trouble of hiding a path toward it, and paths, she'd learned over the last month and a half, usually led somewhere. Ruth Ann's reaction, the next day, was not what Marlowe expected. She'd brought the tin box with her to the gas station, half out of a need to tell somebody, half hoping Ruth Ann might recognize the handwriting. Ruth Ann took one look at the scrap of paper, went quiet in a way that didn't match her usual easy manner, and set the paper down on the counter like it had weight to it. "That's not Cyrus's hand," she said slowly. "I'd know his. Wrote out half the church bulletins for years. I'd recognize that scrawl anywhere." She tapped the paper once. "This is somebody writing to him. Somebody who knew him well enough to leave him a note and trust he'd understand it without more explaining." "Do you know whose it is?" Ruth Ann was quiet for a moment too long. "I've got a guess," she said, "but I've been wrong about this town's secrets before, and I'd rather not put a name to something I can't prove. You ask Hollis. He's been here longer than me, and he's got a better memory for the parts people wanted forgotten." She wouldn't say more than that, no matter how Marlowe pressed, and by the time Marlowe walked the 2 miles back to the church, key heavy in her jacket pocket, she had the uncomfortable sense that everyone in Bethel Creek knew a piece of this story that she didn't, and that all of them, for reasons of their own, were waiting to see whether she'd earn the rest of it before they handed it over. That night, she stood in front of the vestry wall with the iron key in her hand and the cabinet's rusted padlock catching the last of her flashlight beam, and found, for the second time that week, that she wasn't ready yet either. The key didn't fit the padlock, not even close, which meant somewhere on 4 acres of overgrown, half-collapsed property there was another lock still waiting to be found, and she had no idea where to start looking. She spent the better part of a week looking for a lock that key might fit, starting with the obvious places and working her way into the ones that weren't. The cellar was first. She'd meant to search it properly for weeks anyway, ever since the frozen footprint had led her to that locked door and no further. Hollis came by with a new deadbolt as promised, installed it himself in under 20 minutes with the quiet efficiency of a man who'd done the same task 100 times in other people's houses, and stepped back to let her go down first with a flashlight and the iron key held tight in her fist. The cellar smelled like standing water and old stone. Shelves lined one wall, mostly collapsed, holding what looked like decades of church record books gone soft with damp. Their ink bled into illegibility. A second door at the far end, half-rotted, led to what she guessed had once been a coal room. No locks anywhere that matched the key in her hand. No cabinet, no chest, nothing but dust and the particular cold of a room that hadn't felt sunlight in generations. "Not here," Hollis said. Unnecessary, but somehow comforting anyway. And they climbed back up into daylight together. The bell tower was next, and it took her most of a day to clear a safe path up the narrow spiral stairs, testing each step with her weight before committing to it fully. 2 boards gave way entirely under a crowbar's gentle prodding, revealing nothing beneath but structural framing. At the top, the bell itself hung silent and green with age, and beside it, tucked into a gap in the beams, she found a bird's nest, long abandoned, and nothing else. She was starting to understand something about this search that unsettled her more than any locked door could. Whoever had hidden whatever this key opened had wanted it found by someone patient enough to earn it, not stumbled into by accident. That kind of person didn't leave clues in obvious places. It was Ruth Ann, in the end, who nudged her toward the answer, though she didn't seem to realize she was doing it. "You ever been up in that second-story window?" she asked one afternoon, handing over a paper sack of bread across the gas station counter. "The one round back, past the choir loft." "Always thought it was strange, that window. Never did line up with any room I remember being inside." Marlowe went still. She'd noted that exact window on her list weeks ago, visible from outside, corresponding to nothing on the inside, one more detail that didn't add up. She went home and stood outside in the fading light, counting windows against her memory of the church's interior, and confirmed what she already suspected. There was a gap, a space the outside of the building accounted for that the inside did not. It took her 2 days of careful measuring, tapping along walls, and one long conversation with Hollis about how old buildings sometimes hid rooms behind false walls to preserve heat or shelter valuables during hard times, before she found it. A section of the vestry's back wall, panelled in wood rather than plaster like the rest of the room, with a seam so fine she'd walked past it a dozen times without noticing. Behind the panelling, a door, narrow, meant for a much smaller frame than an adult's, likely built for a child, or built simply to be inconspicuous. And set into that door, waiting, a padlock, old and rusted, but a perfect match in size and style to the iron key that had been sitting in her jacket pocket for the better part of 2 weeks. Her hands were shaking when she fit the key into the lock. It turned on the first try, smooth despite decades of neglect, like it had been oiled and waiting. The room behind the door was barely larger than a closet, no window, no light source beyond what her flashlight offered, but it wasn't empty. A single wooden chair sat against the far wall, and beside it a small writing desk, and on that desk, beneath a thin layer of undisturbed dust, a leather-bound journal and a stack of papers held together with a corroded metal clip. She didn't touch anything at first. She just stood in the doorway a long moment, flashlight beam trembling slightly, feeling the particular vertigo of finally reaching a place she'd spent a month and a half trying to reach. The journal's first page, when she finally opened it, was dated some 60 years earlier, and it began simply, "If you're reading this, then the church found the right person after all." She sat down on the small wooden chair, the only piece of furniture in the room, and read by flashlight until her battery started to dim, and what she found in those first pages wasn't money, wasn't gold, wasn't anything she could have named beforehand. It was a man's handwriting, careful and warm, describing a church he'd loved enough to spend a lifetime tending, and a decision he'd made near the end of that lifetime that he clearly hoped someone, someday, would understand. She didn't finish the journal that night. There was too much of it, and her flashlight was dying, and some instinct told her this wasn't a story to rush through by half-light with trembling hands. She closed it carefully, set it back on the desk, exactly where she'd found it, and climbed back through the narrow door into the vestry, locking it again behind her out of some impulse she didn't fully understand, as though the room, having waited this long, deserved to be left in peace one more night before she came back to finish what she'd started. She told Hollis the next morning, standing on the church steps with coffee going cold in her hands, and watched something shift in his weathered face when she described the room, the desk, the journal's opening line. "Whitfield," he said quietly, more to himself than to her. "I always did wonder what happened to the rest of him after he left." "You think Cyrus wrote it?" Hollis didn't answer right away. He looked past her, toward the church, like he was seeing something in its walls that hadn't been visible to him in a very long time. "I think," he said finally, "you'd best finish reading before either of us goes guessing." That afternoon, Roy Tanner's truck came up the drive again, and this time he wasn't alone. A second man sat in the passenger seat, unfamiliar, wearing a suit that looked out of place against the gravel and junipers, carrying a folder thicker than the one Roy had left the last time. Roy didn't get out of the truck right away, which was how Marlowe had learned to read him by now. When he sat behind the wheel a beat too long, it meant he'd rehearsed whatever he was about to say and wasn't sure he still believed it. The man beside him did get out, though, and did it quickly, smoothing his suit jacket against a wind that clearly wasn't part of his usual environment. He introduced himself as Dale Ferris, Regional Development Liaison for a company whose name meant nothing to Marlowe, and handed her a business card before she'd said a single word back to him. "We understand you've made some real progress here," Ferris said, glancing at the patched roof, the cleared debris, the church steps swept free of leaves for the first time in what was probably years. "That's exactly the kind of stabilization work that increases a property's assessed value considerably. Which is good news for you, actually. It means our offer just went up." He said it like a compliment. It didn't land like one. "I'm not selling," Marlowe said. "Nobody's asking you to decide today." Ferris smiled in a way that didn't reach his eyes. But I'd be doing you a disservice if I didn't mention. The county's been reviewing zoning classifications out this way. Historic use exemptions on properties like this one sometimes get revisited when ownership changes hands. Just something to keep in mind, going forward. It wasn't a threat, not exactly. It was close enough to one that Roy wouldn't meet her eyes as they drove off. And that told her more than anything Ferris himself had said. She called the county clerk's office the next morning from the payphone outside Ruth Ann's gas station, since her own phone service had lapsed 2 weeks earlier when she'd chosen a load of lumber over the bill. The clerk was kind but non-committal. Yes, exemptions were occasionally reviewed. No, there was nothing currently pending on Bethel Creek Chapel specifically, but she couldn't promise that would stay true. It was enough uncertainty to sit like a stone in her stomach for the rest of the day. That night, she went back to the hidden room behind the vestry wall, journal in her lap, a fresh flashlight battery giving her more time than the last one had. The handwriting continued in the same careful, warm register as the opening page, and this time she let herself read further. I built this room myself, the journal read, in the spring after the congregation stopped coming for good. Cyrus thought I'd gone strange in the head, hiding money in the walls of a dying church instead of putting it in a bank where sensible men keep such things. Maybe he was right. But banks don't wait for the right person to come looking. This building does. It's patient, the way I never managed to be, in my own life, and I thought, if I can't be patient myself, at least I can build a patient thing, and trust it to do what I couldn't. She read that passage twice. Then a third time. Everett. The entry was signed, near the bottom of the page, in the same hand as the brass plate Hollis had found weeks before. For Everett, who never stopped believing the roof would hold, she understood now that the plate hadn't been left for Everett. It had been left by him, or for him, by someone who loved him, and Cyrus, the caretaker, the organ player, the man who'd vanished one October without explanation, had known him, had maybe been the only one who knew what Everett had done here at all. She brought this to Hollis the following morning, laying it out on the church steps between them, like pieces of a puzzle he might finally be willing to help her finish. Everett Voss, Hollis said, quiet, after a long silence. Now there's a name I haven't heard spoken out loud since I was a young man. He rubbed his jaw, looking older suddenly than she'd seen him look before. He was Cyrus's uncle, kept mostly to himself even before the church emptied out. Folks said he'd lost most of his family young, and never fully trusted that good things were allowed to last. Guess that tracks with what you're describing. Do you know what happened to him, passed on, must be near 50 years back now? Quietly. Cyrus took it hard, from what I remember, hard enough that he wasn't the same after, and a few years later, he left too. Hollis shook his head slowly. Never did know why. Now maybe I do. It wasn't the whole story. She could feel that clearly, the way you feel a flaw that's about to give, even before it does. There was more here, something about why Cyrus left, something the note, not yet. Cyrus was still waiting to explain. But it was more than she'd had a week ago, and for the first time since Ferris's business card had landed in her hand, she felt steadier than afraid. That steadiness didn't last the week. She was up on the roof 3 days later, replacing a final run of shingles before the spring rains were due to start in earnest, when the ladder shifted beneath her. A rung she'd tested a dozen times before, suddenly giving without warning, under a foot of frost-loosened soil she hadn't accounted for. She caught the eave hard enough to save herself from a fall that would have ended considerably worse, but not hard enough to avoid a wrenched shoulder and a gash along her forearm that bled through 2 shirts before she managed to wrap it properly. She sat on the church steps afterward, arm throbbing, shoulder screaming with every small movement, and let herself, for the first time in weeks, seriously consider whether Ferris's number was still on that business card somewhere in her jacket pocket. She didn't call it, but she thought about it long enough that the thought scared her more than the fall had. Hollis found her there an hour later, took one look at the wrapped arm, and didn't say a word about the roof, the ladder, or the shingles still waiting to be finished. He just sat down beside her on the steps, quiet the way he always was, and after a long while said the only thing that seemed to matter. "Everett built a patient thing," he said, "and trusted the right person to finish it. Don't reckon a bad ladder rung changes who that person is." She didn't answer, but she didn't reach for the business card again either, and when she finally stood up to go back inside, she left it folded in her jacket pocket, unlooked at, and picked the ladder back up instead. Her shoulder healed into something stiff and permanent, feeling faster than she expected, though the ache stayed with her through most of the following week, a dull reminder every time she reached overhead. She kept working anyway, favoring her left arm, and found that Ruth Ann had apparently decided this was the week to visit in person rather than just leaving bread on the steps. "Heard about the ladder," Ruth Ann said, setting a jar of something dark and homemade on the church's front step, along with a folded dish towel that turned out to be wrapped around a proper meal rather than just bread. "Small town. News travels faster than the weather does." "I'm fine." "Didn't say you weren't." Ruth Ann settled herself onto the step with the particular ease of someone whose knees had made peace with getting down and back up slowly. Just seemed like a week somebody ought to check on you in person instead of leaving groceries and driving off. They sat together a while, and it was during that unhurried quiet that Marlowe finally asked the question she'd been circling for days. "You said you had a guess about who wrote that note." "Not yet, Cyrus. Will you tell me now?" Ruth Ann was quiet long enough that Marlowe thought she might refuse again, but something in the last 2 months seemed to have shifted her calculation. "I think Everett wrote it," she said finally. "For Cyrus." "Meaning, not yet is it time for you to open this, or maybe not yet are you ready? I always heard it was Everett who built out that hidden room, back before I was much more than a girl myself. And I always heard Cyrus knew about it, and never touched it. Not once, the whole time he kept this place." "Why not that?" Ruth Ann said. "I truly don't know, but I'd wager it's in that journal somewhere, if you keep reading." She did keep reading, that night and the next, working through the journal's middle pages by the light of a lamp Hollis had rigged up from salvaged parts. Everett's handwriting grew shakier as the entries progressed, spanning what she guessed was the final year or two of his life, and the tone shifted alongside it. Less reflection, more plain accounting, as though he'd sensed time running short and wanted to leave fewer things unsaid. "Cyrus doesn't understand why I won't spend a cent of it on myself," one entry read, "and I've never found the words to explain it to him properly. It was never mine to spend. It came to me sideways, through no virtue of my own, and money that arrives that way has a way of feeling borrowed rather than owned. I'd rather it sit patient in these walls until it finds someone who needs the foundation more than I ever did, than watch it thin out on comforts that never once made me less lonely." She sat with that passage a long time, turning it over, understanding it a little more each time she reread it. Not because it explained the mechanics of what waited in the vestry wall, but because it explained something about why it had waited so long to be found at all. The financial pressure, meanwhile, hadn't eased. A hard frost had cracked 2 sections of pipe she hadn't known were vulnerable, and repairing them ate through nearly all the small cushion of savings she'd carried in from that first courthouse transaction. She was down to counting bills again some nights, the way she had on that curb 3 months earlier, though it felt different now, less like drowning, more like treading water she'd finally learned to trust her own arms in. It was around this time that Roy Tanner showed up alone, without Ferris, without a folder, just his truck and a bag of feed he genuinely had no reason to be delivering to a church with no livestock. "Wasn't sure you'd want to see me," he admitted, standing at the tailgate, not quite meeting her eyes. "You've been pretty clear about wanting me gone." "That's not." He stopped, exhaled hard, started over. My hardware store's been losing money 3 years running. Big box place, opened up 40 minutes out. And half my regulars drive there now, for anything that isn't an emergency. Ferris's company offered me a finder's fee if this deal went through. Wasn't going to say no to that, not with what I owe on the store. It was the first honest thing he'd said to her since she'd arrived, and it landed harder than any of his warnings had. "I'm still not selling," she said. "I figured." He almost smiled. "Guess I respect that more than I expected to. Doesn't put money in my register, but I respect it." He set the bag of feed down anyway, useless as it was, like he needed some excuse for the visit to have existed. "For what it's worth, the roof, the pipes, all of it, you're doing better than most people give you credit for, including me, for a good while there." He left without asking anything else of her, and she stood there a long moment after his truck disappeared down the gravel drive, recalibrating what she'd thought she understood about him. That night, reading further into the journal by lamplight, she reached an entry near its final pages that stopped her cold, not because of what it said about the money, but because of a single line tucked near the bottom, almost an afterthought. "If Cyrus never comes back for it, then whoever the church chooses next should know the truth about why he left, and why I never once blamed him for it." The next page was torn out, cleanly, deliberately, along a straight edge, not decayed, not accidental. Someone had removed it on purpose, and whatever explanation Everett had written about Cyrus's departure was gone with it. The storm came in fast, the way spring storms did in that part of the country. Clear skies at noon, then a green-black wall of cloud rolling in from the west by 4, moving faster than the weather radio at Ruth Ann's station had predicted. Marlowe was up checking the patched sections of roof when the wind hit hard enough to nearly take her off her feet, and by the time she'd scrambled down the ladder and gotten inside, rain was coming sideways in sheets that turned the gravel drive into a shallow river. She lost power within the hour. The old fuse box, still not fully trusted even after her repairs, sparked once and went dark for good, leaving her with nothing but a flashlight and the sound of the building groaning around her in a way she'd never heard it groan before. She thought about Hollis, alone at the edge of town. She thought about the loose section of roof near the bell tower she hadn't quite finished securing. Mostly, though, she thought about riding it out, because there was nowhere else to go, and no way to get there even if there had been. The worst of it came just after 7, when a gust strong enough to rattle the stained glass in its frame tore a section of tarp free from the bell tower roof. And within minutes, water was pouring through the gap in a steady sheet, running down the inside wall of the choir loft and pooling exactly where the vestry's false paneling met the original stone. She heard the wood give before she saw it, a groan, then a crack, then the sound of something heavy shifting behind a wall that had held its secret for 60 years. By the time she got her flashlight on it, a section of the paneling near the hidden door had buckled outward, water-swollen, and finally too weak to hold its shape, exposing several feet of the original stone behind it that had never been part of the hidden room at all. A narrow gap, maybe 18 inches wide, that ran between the false wall and the church's true foundation. Wedged into that gap, half disintegrated by decades of trapped damp, was a single folded page. She worked it free with shaking hands, careful not to tear what little of it had survived, and recognized the handwriting immediately, the same careful, warm hand from the journal. The missing page she'd been certain was gone for good. Most of the ink had bled and blurred beyond reading, but enough survived in patches to make out fragments. Never forgave myself for being in the city chasing work the week his heart finally gave out. He raised me after my own folks were gone, and I repaid it by being absent when it mattered most. Couldn't stand to keep the money he left me. Not after that. Not when I hadn't earned even the right to grieve him properly. She sat on the wet floor with the ruined page in her lap, and the storm still tearing at the roof above her, and understood, finally, why Cyrus Whitfield had walked away from Bethel Creek Chapel one October and never come back. He hadn't fled out of greed, or carelessness, or the simple restlessness Ruth Ann and Hollis had both hinted at without quite saying. He'd fled out of shame, the belief that he'd failed the one person who'd ever truly taken him in, and that touching the inheritance Everett left him would have meant accepting a forgiveness he didn't think he deserved. It was nearly midnight before the wind finally eased enough for her to assess the real damage. A section of roof, gone entirely near the bell tower, water pooled 2 inches deep across half the sanctuary floor. The hidden room's paneling collapsed outward into the vestry in a way that would take real carpentry to repair. She should have felt defeated. Instead, sitting there in the wreckage with a page of a dead man's confession drying carefully on the windowsill beside her, she felt something closer to clarity than she had in weeks. Hollis arrived at first light, took one look at the damage, and didn't say a word about how bad it was. He listened instead, quiet and still, as she read him what remained of the torn page. When she finished, he was silent long enough that she thought the storm might have taken something from him too. "There's been a fella," he said finally, choosing his words with unusual care. "Comes through town maybe once a year. Older gentleman. Never talks to anybody, never stays long, just walks the edge of this property some evenings and leaves again before morning. I always figured it was somebody with an old memory of the place. Never once thought to ask him his name." Marlowe felt something cold move through her that had nothing to do with the storm. "The footprint," she said. "Back in the fall. Leading up to the cellar door and nowhere else." "Could be," Hollis said quietly. "Could well be." He didn't finish the thought, and neither did she. But they both stood in the ruined vestry a long moment afterward, looking at the collapsed paneling and the ruined page and the narrow hidden room beyond it, understanding without saying it aloud that somewhere out there, an old man who believed himself unworthy of forgiveness might still be walking the edge of this land every year, checking on a debt he'd never let himself pay off, and that the storm, for all the damage it had done, had just handed her the first real chance to find him before another year slipped past. It took her 3 weeks to find him, and in the end, it wasn't detective work that did it. It was patience. The same quality Everett's journal had circled back to again and again, the willingness to wait for the right moment, instead of forcing one. She'd asked around gently at first, careful not to spook whatever thread she was following. The gas station in the next town over remembered an older man who came through once a year, always in early spring, always alone, paying cash for a single night at the motel down the road before disappearing again by morning. The motel clerk, after some hesitation and a $5 tip she genuinely couldn't spare, admitted he sometimes signed the guest register under the name C. Whitfield, though he'd never once given a forwarding address. So she waited. She kept working, repairing the storm damage with Hollis's steady guidance, rebuilding the section of roof near the bell tower, reinforcing the vestry paneling with proper lumber this time, instead of the thin panels that had given way in the storm. And she kept the ruined page from the hidden gap dried flat under glass on the small desk in the room where Everett had once sat writing by lamplight, waiting for the right person to find it. He came on a Tuesday evening in early April, nearly a year to the day since the storm, walking the tree line at the edge of the property, the way Hollis had described, slow and careful. A man in his 80s now, moving like every step cost him something. She didn't call out to him right away. She let him walk the perimeter first, the way he must have done every year for longer than she'd been alive, and only when he reached the cellar door, the same door his footprint had led to and never left, did she step out onto the porch and say his name. He went very still. "I'm not here to make you leave," she said, before he could turn and go. "I found the room. I found the journal. I found the page that tore out, too. Most of it, anyway, what the water left behind." Cyrus Whitfield stood in the failing light for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice was rougher than she expected. worn thin by decades of not using it for much, beyond ordering coffee and signing false names in motel registers. "Then you know I don't deserve to be the one standing here," he said. "I know Everett didn't think that," she said. "I've read his words enough times now to know that much for certain." She invited him inside, and he came, hesitant, like a man stepping into a memory he'd spent 50 years trying to outrun. He sat in the third pew from the back, the same one she'd chosen herself, her very first night in this building, and she brought him the journal and the page under glass and let him read in silence for a long time while the last of the daylight faded through the repaired stained glass overhead. When he finished, he wept, quietly, the way men of his generation seemed to have been taught to do it, without much sound, just his shoulders moving and his hands pressed flat against his knees. "I told myself for 50 years that staying away was the only honest thing left to do," he said finally. "That taking a cent of what he left me would have been theft. After what I did, after where I was, the week he passed, chasing work in the city instead of sitting with him like I should have." He looked up at her, eyes wet, decades of grief, finally finding somewhere to land. "You're telling me he didn't see it that way? He built a room to hide money he didn't think was his to spend either," Marlowe said gently. "He said as much, right in these pages. I think you two understood each other better than either of you ever said out loud." They sat together in the sanctuary long after dark, Hollis arriving partway through with a lantern and a look on his face like he was seeing a ghost he'd stopped expecting to meet. And between the three of them, the last of the story finally came together. Whole, Everett's quiet decades of hoarding a fortune he refused to touch, his hope that it might someday find its way to someone who needed the foundation more than comfort, and Cyrus's 50 years of self-imposed exile, believing himself unworthy of an inheritance built from love he didn't think he'd earned. "He'd have wanted you to have some part of this," Marlowe said, once the tin box and its remaining contents, a modest sum, carefully documented in ledgers Everett had kept alongside the journal, along with a small collection of coins that turned out, upon later appraisal, to be worth considerably more than their face value, had been laid out between them on the pew. Cyrus shook his head slowly. "I've made my peace a different way," he said, "watching this church come back to life again, after all these years. That's more than I ever thought I'd get to see. Keep the rest. Put it toward the roof, the walls, whatever it needs. I think that's closer to what he meant, in the end, than any of us understood at the time." He stayed 3 days before returning to whatever quiet life he'd built for himself elsewhere, and before he left, he gave her one more thing, an address, and permission to write to him, the first real connection he'd allowed himself to this place, or to anyone, in half a century. Marlowe stood on the church steps and watched his car disappear down the gravel drive, the building behind her finally, truly whole for the first time since she'd arrived. Roof sound, walls sturdy, the hidden room, no longer hidden, but simply another part of the church's long memory, waiting now, not to be found, but to be lived in. She had no way of knowing yet that within the year, a stranger, even younger than she'd been on that first curb, would come walking up this same gravel drive, carrying nothing but a duffel bag, and a look she recognized instantly, because she'd worn it herself once. The girl who came walking up the gravel drive the following spring was 17, maybe 18, carrying a duffel bag with a broken zipper and a look on her face that Marlowe recognized before the girl had said a single word. That particular mix of exhaustion and defiance that comes from having learned too early that nobody was coming to save you, so you'd better learn to save yourself. Her name was Dessa. She'd aged out of the foster system 8 months earlier, bounced between 2 jobs and a series of couches that never lasted, and had heard, from a cousin of a cousin, the way these things traveled in towns small enough to still talk to each other, that there was a woman out past the county line who'd turned an abandoned church into something worth seeing, and who sometimes had work for someone willing to do it. Marlowe hired her that same afternoon, mostly on instinct, and put her to work sanding a section of pew that had been waiting 2 years for someone with the patience to finish it properly. It wasn't lost on her, watching Dessa's hands find their rhythm with the sandpaper, how closely the shape of this moment echoed one from her own life. Hollis's truck idling in the drive that first week, a stranger's quiet decision to help without being asked, the slow, unglamorous work of teaching someone that a ruined thing could still be worth saving if you were willing to put in the hours. She found herself repeating things Hollis had once told her almost word for word, and understood, finally, what he must have felt watching her learn the same lessons he was passing down, without ever quite naming them as lessons. Bethel Creek Chapel, 2 years on from that storm, bore almost no resemblance to the building she'd first walked into, with 2 garbage bags and a manila envelope containing a key to nowhere. The roof had held through 3 more winters. The stained glass, painstakingly repaired panel by panel, threw its full colors across the sanctuary floor now, instead of thin blades through gaps in plywood. The pews were whole again, oiled to a warm shine, and on Sunday mornings, not services, not exactly, but a kind of open gathering Ruth Ann had suggested, and the town had slowly warmed to, the building filled with more people than it had seen in 6 decades. Roy Tanner came to those gatherings now, most weeks, and had taken to bringing his own grandchildren to see the building his hardware store had helped rebuild, a fact he mentioned more often than was strictly necessary. His store, against his own expectations, had found new life supplying lumber and tools for a wave of small restoration projects that followed in Bethel Creek Chapel's wake, as though the town itself had needed permission to believe old, unwanted things were still worth saving. Hollis still came by most days, slower now than he'd been that first year, but no less steady. He'd taken to sitting in the 3rd pew during the Sunday gatherings, in the same spot Cyrus had once sat reading a 50-year-old confession by lamplight, and Marlowe suspected he chose that seat on purpose, though neither of them had ever discussed it directly. She still wrote to Cyrus twice a year, and twice a year a careful, steadying letter came back, describing a small, quiet life that seemed, slowly, to be forgiving itself. The tin box and its contents had done exactly what Everett Voss had once hoped, in his careful, old-fashioned hand, that they might, not simply repaired a roof or replaced rotted beams, though they'd done that too, but had become the foundation, in the truest sense of the word, for something that outlasted the money itself. A church brought back from the edge of collapse, a town that had slowly remembered how to gather, a woman who'd arrived with $5 and a stranger's forwarding address, and had built, out of patience and stubbornness and other people's quiet kindness, a life she no longer had to survive, but had actually chosen. That evening, after Dessa had gone home to whatever temporary arrangement she was currently making work, Marlowe sat alone in the sanctuary as the last of the daylight moved through the repaired stained glass, painting the floor in red and gold the way it had that very first afternoon, when she'd been too exhausted and too frightened to do anything but cry for exactly 4 minutes before picking herself back up. She thought about Everett, writing alone in a hidden room for decades, trusting a building to wait for the right person the way he never quite managed to trust people. She thought about Cyrus, 50 years of walking the tree line at dusk, carrying a grief he'd finally set down. She thought about her own $5, folded soft in her palm on a curb in the rain, and how something that small had somehow been enough, in the end, to become all of this. If there's one thing this old church taught me, she found herself thinking, it's that the things worth having were never about the money at all. They were about somebody, somewhere, deciding you were worth being patient for. If this story meant something to you, if some part of it reminded you that starting over is never really starting from nothing, I'd love to hear about it in the comments. And if you want more stories like this one, stick around and subscribe, because there's always another door waiting somewhere to be opened.